Today on the Perception and Action podcast, Perception and Action Journal Club number 4, discussing the article Ecological Cognition, Expert Decision-Making Behavior in Sport. So it's time for a call to action. Hi everyone, this is Rob Gray from Arizona State University and PerceptionAction.com. Welcome to the Perception and Action podcast, where I discuss how psychological research can be applied to improving performance, accelerating skill acquisition, and designing technologies. In today's episode, I'm joined by James Vaughn, Ben Franks, Shawn Myska, Tyler Yearby, and Stuart Armstrong for a great discussion about this recent paper by Duarte Araujo and colleagues outlining the ecological approach to decision-making in sport. Hope you enjoy. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Perception and Action Journal Club. We're joined by 3 people right now, and I think we might have a couple joining us in a couple of minutes too. So I'm going to let them go around the room and introduce themselves. So we'll start on the below me. Sounds weird. The bottom apartment, Shawn Myska, returning many times.
Rob, my friend, thank you so much, and I appreciate James and Ben, and obviously all the listeners from the community out there. Like my friend Rob Gray just mentioned, my name is Shawn Myska. I'm the co-director of education currently at Emergence, which is a movement skill education company, and I think we may have Tyler, my other co-director of education, joining us here shortly. That's my sort of night job. My day job is I work as a movement skill acquisition coach for National Football League players, and I've done that now for 12 going on 13 years. And then finally, I am the president or founder of the Sport Movement Skill Conference, which we're a little over a month away. And obviously, Rob is one of our keynote presenters, and now we're joined by another one, and my friend Stuart Armstrong there as well. So that's a short snippet on me, and I can't wait to discuss this topic with you all.
Okay, and well, maybe James next. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure, I'll be really brief. At least I'll attempt to be. So I'm a football coach at AIK in Stockholm, and I've recently completed my PhD looking at how culture influences the way we play football with a particular view to creativity. That'll do.
Okay, and Ben?
Excited to be here though, so thank you.
Oh, good, great, thank you. And returning contestant, Ben?
I'm a PhD researcher in skill acquisition, focusing on kind of the quiet eye and ecological psychology and linking the two together. I'm a football coach as well, but less renowned and probably knowledgeable than James. But I'm pretty more research focused than I am practical these days. So, but yeah.
Great. And then we've got in the bottom middle square now, Stuart Armstrong. Stuart, can you tell us a little bit about introduce yourself?
Hi, Rob. Hi, everybody. Stuart Armstrong. I don't have anything like the academic firepower that some of my colleagues on here have. I call myself a probably academic wannabe. I work in the field of sports coaching in a day job, and I also spend some time thinking and sharing some thoughts via a couple of means, blogging and podcasting in the main. And everybody on this call has been a guest, and I've been very grateful for their contributions, because the show's only as good as the guest contributions. And I'm really looking forward to chatting with you all tonight.
Great, thank you. And then last but not least, in the bottom left, we have Tyler. Can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, certainly can. I apologize. I have some seasonal allergies here, and so I'll have to be quite concise with my talking today. So more than anything, thrilled to be here. Stuart's laughing at me because I was just on his show just the other day and sounded completely normal. So
I wore you out, Tyler. I wore you out.
Much in the same way as Stuart's. I don't quite have the firepower that everybody else does, but I will bring what I can. I've been in the industry for about 15 years. I'm a co-founder, co-director of education of Emergence, and I identify as a sport movement specialist or a skill acquisition coach as well. Looking to do what I can to help guide my athletes to acquire and or adapt their skills to the changing environmental demands.
Great. Okay. Thanks for joining me. We've got a full house here today. I think this is as many as I can fit in here. So today we want to talk about this paper titled Ecological Cognition, Expert Decision Making Behavior in Sport by Eduardo Rojo and Keith Davids and a bunch of other prominent people in this area. And so I'm going to start off probably a bit different than people are expecting because, not surprisingly, we have a fairly biased sample of guests here that I think are going to favor the ecological approach. But what I wanted to start off with was focusing on the other side. What this paper is called they call the perceptual cognitive framework, or sometimes we call it the information processing framework. So what I wanted to start off by asking the group is, they start the paper this way. What are the main critiques, problems, issues with this traditional approach, the perceptual cognitive framework, that we need a new one, right? So I don't, if someone wants to jump in either from the paper or something you've experienced in your own coaching or your own reading. So what are we trying to address, the issues?
Well, I'll jump in there and just simply give my first where my brain goes, and that is maybe a little bit more respect for the environment and the problems that it presents, and the ongoing control or regulation of movement predicated on what that problem in this environment is offering to us. So obviously I'm going to try to keep things concise there as well, because there's a lot of good thoughts I think that are going to circulate here from this group. So that's first and foremost for me, respecting the problem, respecting the environment.
Okay.
So I can jump on one that I've been.
Can I pause for a bit? I'm getting a lot of feedback. So if everyone can mute your mic when you're not talking I'm not sure where it's coming from. It's in the bottom there. Yeah, that sounds bad. Okay, Ben.
A problem I've been dealing with is a lot of information processing in terms of a research perspective kind of always generalizes to a mean across a group. So rather than exploring those intra individual variabilities between participants or between a sample, and not necessarily appreciating the noise or variability that exists in a movement skill or a perceptual skill. That's one of the big ones I've been going through at the moment.
Okay, so lack of focus on the individual and individual differences. Yeah, that's a good one, definitely. Anyone else have a thought on kind of what you feel as the limitations with this traditional approach?
Yeah, for me, the dualism, and whether it's, or the dualisms, if you like, whether it's mind, body, and then you've also got kind of related social material, and I suppose that history of reductionism that kind of sits in the background of that is, I suppose, contributing to this lack of emphasis on the environmental context or some sort of cultural sensitivity. So for me, it kind of provides. It seems to provide only a limited view of the picture, the phenomena that we want to understand. So, and I think unfortunately that limited view is then kind of taken, and then people build programs of practice on that, which obviously are based on a limited view and therefore not always as accurate as we would like them to be.
Mm-hmm. So too narrow is kind of, and not taking into account. Yeah.
Summary of that.
No, well, I'm glad you said it. Well, anyone else have any other?
Yeah, just to add to it, the reductionist aspect of it, I couldn't agree more with that. I think that too often coaches create these practice situations where decisions are made in an entirely different context than what the game actually behaves like. And so you get the fidelity or the action fidelity and the information that's available that is regulating that movement, much in the same way that Shawn mentioned, is quite different than how it actually then behaves in the game. So I think that kind of part approach where we then kind of bottle it up into different pieces and then hope that it kind of packages itself back together in the end is something that is very limiting with an information processing approach.
Yeah. Any other thoughts? So,
what came to mind there, Rob, is also this kind of bias towards verbal communication or like declarative knowledge. So this is something that I'm quite interested in at the moment. And in the paper, they actually talk about it. I think it's page 11 when they start to address the difference between direct perception and indirect perception. And I think they have, they kind of, well, do a really, really good job, mostly in kind of talking about the differences there. But for me, there's a lot of coach talk about the game. And then once we step over that white line, or rather the players step over that white line, I just wonder how valuable is that talk about the game? How valuable is the principle or the concept, the abstract concept that's been talked about, like the defensive triangle? Like, am I running around on the pitch looking for a defensive triangle? Like, the language, the communication so often doesn't direct us to the environment. So for me, I'm not sure if that's actually relates to the question so much, but well, no, I suppose it does. It does. We end up with abstract concepts that don't help people attune to the environment.
Yeah. No, I think so. I think there's some good points there. Yeah, in a way, I think. Stuart, did you have a?
Well, the only thing I was going to say is something I was talking about with Tyler and Marianne Davis, who I know you had on last week, Rob, which was when it comes to exploring even just ideas of how people are introduced to movement and how they're introduced to the wonderful world of physical activity. It's a lot of the ways in which the early introductions are provided particularly for young people, are predicated on this idea that they need to perform an idealized model. And a lot of that is based on this idea that people have these internal representations of the way movement should look, and then all you really need to do is to articulate that movement to somebody else, and then they can do the same thing. And what it forgets is that every individual has their own repertoire, and it's about the way in which they can interface with whatever the task at hand is, based on their own internal repertoire. And finding out where those two things meet is the really exciting thing that an individual can actually explore. And once they do, it's really quite a transformative experience and something really quite exciting. But they're too often robbed of that from the early stage because we have these sort of idealized models. So for me, I suppose it's around that kind of early experience for young people in particular, and their early experiences in things like PE, but also in early sports experiences, that I feel is an area that we really need to address. And the information processing model has been pretty dominant in that space, I feel like, because I see the way that's the part of me that feels that if we can think about some reconceptualizations, then maybe the experience could get better too.
Yeah, no, I think that's good. In a way, I like this paper a lot, but I'm going to be critical of it. Obviously, in a way, I think you guys did a better job of explaining critiquing the information processing in the paper. One of the things I find happens a lot in this area is when we're critiquing what we don't like about the information processing, we go into talking about what the ecological dynamics is. Right? Those are two different. What I'd like people to think about is distinguishing problems with the traditional approach from having alternative view, right? The idea that perception is direct is an alternative view. It's not a critique of the other problem, right? It's just an alternative way of looking at the world. So, because I get a lot of people asking me, is that the reason that the information processing is garbage or flawed or terrible? No, it's an idea that's built from very smart people for a long time. So I think sometimes we have to be careful about what we don't like about it. They go in a lot of points about talking about representations. Is that an issue people also have as well? The appeal to mental representations, internal knowledge. Is that something that kind of irks people when they hear the information processing?
Yeah.
I'll jump in and say that bothers me pretty bad, mainly because that means that needs to exist there. That representation needs to exist somewhere for everyone. And then kind of going back to that idealized pattern, the fact that idealized pattern needs to exist as a representation, and that, as an indirect perception view, we're viewing information or stimuli or cues that are impoverished, that need to be essentially updated, and that the world is not rich enough, the energy exchange, the mutuality is not rich enough, but yet somewhere in our brain that we're not even sure where that actually exists. We need to then update that information that we're taking in, or that cue that then sparked that recall to find that representation. So that part's where it really irks me, is the fact that we feel the need that we need to create something that is better than what the environment has already provided.
Mm-hmm.
Rob, it also, to me, suggests that the coach, and if I can talk from a coach's perspective, has the knowledge, which is that internal representation, and they've gone away on a coaching course and they've discovered this or been taught it, and then they bring it to the player, and they're just going to provide that. So that it's, for me, it only reinforces like a top-down knowledge transfer, as opposed to something that is more co-created, and also recognizing that the athletes might be able to come up with things and do things in ways that we've never imagined, and almost I don't know, it almost stokes a bit of ego in the coach and their role, rather than coming alongside and facilitating maybe what the athlete can do, and recognizing that they've kind of got everything they need to solve the problems and do it in their own way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I say you can. Oh, sure, go.
Sorry.
I was just simply going to add then, I think, from what James is saying, and then also what Tyler was saying, and I think where the misrepresentation of this idea of mental representations or the memory enrichment of it, I think then emerges this idea that there can be a correct decision or a best decision, as opposed to a range of functional decisions, or the functionality, and then obviously degeneracy and functional equivalence or abundance of all those degrees of freedom of the movement system, beyond there being a one best way or a one correct way.
Mm-hmm.
I think if I'm deliberately back for the information processing side from it, you can see the appeal of kind of representations and the link to long-term working memory, and it does make sense, and it probably picks up on areas that perhaps an alternative paradigm such as the ecological approach is not necessarily less clear on, but less easy to access in terms of our understanding of how those kind of links are made. So you can see why a representative account for cognition is provided. It makes clear logical sense that you have a recognized pattern of behavior, you call on some other external factors, whether it's recall or whatever, and that links to long-term working memory, and you create a schema, you kind of all the other elements of it. It does make some kind of sound reasonable sense.
Well, from Western traditions, perhaps. So with the legacy of, Descartes and Newton and all that good stuff that's helped us so much, I wonder if it would make so much sense if we were looking at it from more of an Eastern perspective. Well, this is kind of like a little hobby of mine at the moment. I'm trying to read up on this, and the more I read about Eastern philosophy, the more resonates with the ecological approach. There's so much in that, the 2,000 years ago, from whether it's Confucius, whether it's Taoism, whether it's Buddhism, whether it's Japanese focus on aesthetic and intellect. There's so much in it. So I take your point, Ben. I think it's a really fair one, but I wonder how that might differ if we had a different kind of philosophical take on the world.
I'll jump in there and add something from personal experience that I had speaking to the Eastern Hemisphere. I was teaching a course about 2.5 years ago in Tokyo, Japan. And I was actually at that time, I've shared actually on a handful of the different podcasts here, but most specifically Stuart's, that I was kind of turning the dial all the way towards an ecological approach to learning and problem solving versus teaching a technique or a perfect technique. So at that particular time, about 20% of the course was still this is kind of how you need to move in this situation. And the other 80% was the other bit. And I made a comment that this is how it would need to look. And one of the attendees said, well, what about the opponent? And I said, I don't understand. And he said, well, shouldn't it matter, or wouldn't it matter what your opponent is doing, how you would move? And so not that that's going to kind of capture the way everyone views indirect, direct perception, but it was just really striking to me the fact that individual asked that question. And so maybe it was influenced based off of how they learned.
Stuart, did you want to
Yeah. I was just reflecting a little bit on what Ben and James were saying, which is you can sort of understand why the information processing account is so sticky. It's pretty resilient, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
People are hanging on to it pretty hard. I mean, and your point is a really good one, Rob, which is to say that, like you say, it's stood the test of time. So, there's got to be something there. But one of the problems for me with it is it sort of stops people from accepting an alternative, or that there could be other explanations that we could explore, because it's kind of it's almost constraining in itself of how you perceive the way human behavior takes place. And that in itself makes it difficult to conceptualize something else. I mean, James is talking about Eastern philosophy, which a good swathe of the Western population consider to be complete mumbo jumbo, and genuinely would come out with that. But a lot of people look at it and think, wow, there's something really exciting in there. And I suppose, so there's a challenge, I think, there, which is to say, yeah, you don't want to necessarily get rid of it all or throw it all away, because there may be some value to that. But if it's going to stop you truly exploring an alternative, then you may have no choice. And so that's something I find a real tension with. The kind of the desire to hold on, limiting the true exploration, is something I find really difficult with the information processing model, which is probably one of the reasons why I've sort of been a bit like, all the dial, I'm full throttle in one side of things, because I almost don't want to kind of keep myself held back by a previous sort of paradigm while I explore the other one. Now, that's not to say I'm completely dismissing the other one. It's just I feel like I need to in order to truly explore. I don't know. It's just a personal view, really.
No, I think that's a great way to put it, Stuart. I have the same kind of feeling. One of the issues I try to get across in my podcast is I think the information processing approach, it's been around for so long, and it's so intuitive to other ways things work that people forget it's built on like indirect perception is an assumption, just as valid or not valid as direct perception. But people don't want to treat it that way. They treat it like it's built on facts of life. Like, how else could decision making work than I take in information and compare it to memory? How else could it work? That's an assumption. So I think you're right. So it resists this kind of ability to explore the other thing. One of the things I think, James, did you want to have a point?
Well, I was just going to say, building on that, I think the whole idea that we can predict and control human behavior seems to be something that resonates with the information processing approach and associated approaches as well, and almost brings like this idea that there's some sort of certainty. Whereas the ecological approach or a complex systems approach, or embracing the paradigm of complexity, is the other way around. It's recognizing uncertainty and change being absolutely fundamental. So just to kind of build on or kind of talk to your point, Stu, I think it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and I'm starting to get some questions in here. I'll get to them from people watching along. But one more thing, a couple of points. I think the paper does do a good job, like you were mentioning, Shawn, of pointing at there's not one correct decision. And I wanted to ask, I'm kind of playing the devil's advocate here because we're a bit of biased group here, but one of the things we say, so the traditional approach is that decision making happens. We take in perceptual information, we compare it to some mental model, internal knowledge, and we recognize this situation I've seen before, and then we know what to do. And one of the criticisms that we have from the ecological approach is the environment's just too dynamic and ever changing. There's no possible way that you could have enough to these templates or models. Things happen too fast. Garrett was pointing it out, things are happening too fast for you to be able to access these things in memory and do it. Do you think we oversell that a bit too much? That everything is constantly changing in the environment? Aren't there some regularities and things that we could pick up that, I've seen this before kind of effect?
Well, go ahead.
Ben.
Go ahead, Ben.
You sure?
Mm-hmm.
I think what we mean by changing and dynamic needs to be more specific, because we're not talking about things being complete and utter chaotic flux. There's still parameters and stabilities on that environment. there's still parameters we have to act within. There's still parameters on us as a movement system and how we interact with that information. It's just the minor constraints, if you want to use the word, on that environment can elicit an observed and objective like functional coordination changes or differences in the perceptual motor system. So it's not necessarily that the world is spiraling in an uncontrolled manner. There's still I don't want to say a deterministic model, but there's still a level of causality that exists in the environment that links to our behavior, I think, as a point.
Tyler, did you have?
Yeah, all I was going to add to that was kind of piggybacking off of it, and very similar in the fact that to kind of go back to the constraints or informational boundaries per se. You have things such as the markers on a space. So on a football field, you have the boundaries, you have the goalposts. The basketball court, soccer pitch could be the same way. So you have constraints that are relatively fixed, or to a certain extent. You have rules that are relatively fixed to a certain extent. Maybe even social cultural ideas that are somewhat fixed in a particular area. So those ideas maybe aren't necessarily as chaotic or as dynamic, but yet all of the other information that interacts in that system is dynamic. And so, for me, coming from a practitioner level, why I feel that it does occur, and going back to the point you had made in such a fast or, in a non-fixed way, is the fact that the games that we're working with are very quick. They are very fast moving. Decisions emerge. You hear athletes all the time talking about how, I'm not quite sure how that happened. Maybe they came into it with one particular intention, such as just moving the ball in bounds in basketball. And then all of a sudden my teammate slips free and all of a sudden I'm able to hit him for an alley-oop. My intention changed as the information in front of me changed. And that, as going back to the initial point that Shawn made, that guided further movement.
Mm-hmm. James?
Yeah, I think it's like Tyler, I think that was really, really well put. And it was really nice to hear you include sociocultural constraints in that as well, because that was something that was kind of rattling around in my mind. And then I suppose is it a consideration of the timescales at which constraints are more changeable? I mean, if we look at cultural constraints, that can be over years, potentially over decades, whereas the movements of the opposition is kind of second to second. And I think it's also a really valid point around the games that we're interested in, the types of decision making that we're interested in as well. It tends to be that we're trying to figure out how athletes make these split-second decisions or adaptations in what they're doing. How are they doing one thing and then doing another? So I suppose coming back to what you mentioned, Rob, at the start is do we overplay how dynamic the environment is? I think when we recognize that scale, which can go right the way up to constraints at the level of sociocultural, right the way down to the I suppose within the body and then the opposition as well. I don't know. I'll throw it back to you. Do you think we overplay it?
I think sometimes a little bit. I think the key point is that I think we're not denying that the experience plays a role, like the athlete's experience with different situations in a game. We're not denying an ecological approach that has no role. We're just saying it's used in a very different way than a storage of I've seen this before plays, right? So I think that's the point. So we're getting some questions related to that. So why don't we turn to the ecological? So does someone want to take a crack at what is the ecological approach to this decision making? How does it differ from this traditional approach? Someone who feels like giving a quick summary, elevator speech summary.
Well, I think we were just about to lead to it. You were nicely just setting the springboard for us there, Rob. Mm-hmm. Which is almost thinking about it, from what it isn't. What it isn't is an idea that, here's a situation. Let me just reach into my mental bag of movement possibilities. Oh, I've got one. I think this one might fit the bill. Let me just plug it in. Oh, here we go. Oh, damn, that one didn't work. Let me try another one. I mean, does that make any sense? I mean, in my mind, obviously it doesn't, but I agree, I am massively biased. But there's a little part of me that can't believe that I was so wedded to that idea for such a long time. It obviously I think it makes sense on simplistically, it makes sense, that idea of, you build up a repertoire of motor programs and then you then apply them into some sort of context. But it just doesn't really bear out when you get to it. So as by way of an explanation, the explanation is, stuff happens around us, and we as organisms can choose to either completely block ourselves off from that, or we can be really open to it. And the more open we are to it, the more able we are to respond and act within the environment. The problem often being within most sort of sports experiences is that they tend to lock people away because they're so busy trying to do these sort of motor programs that they're supposed to store away, that actually switches them off from the awareness they require in order to take on board the information that's all around them. So for me, the ecological approach is just being attuned to information to enable you to then respond to that in some way that may or may not create an opportunity for you to act that may or may not help you within whatever task you have in the game that you're playing. That's the way I think about it.
I would add to that two words you said there. Well, three actually. One that I obviously loved, attuned, and then the other two, open and awareness, that you mentioned. When I hear open, I hear sensitive, or high sensitivity, attunement, and the difference being for me that the written definition of ecological dynamics as complex adaptive systems, and athletes and sports teams can be both complex and adaptive systems. That adaptive piece is the piece that is crucial for me. Meaning that, experience, Rob, you had mentioned that experience does in fact matter, and I would highly agree that it does matter. And the difference or the divide for me is if we're looking at it from an ecological scale, if I am away from the activity that is going to be including the relevant informational variables that I need to become attuned to, such as the spacing differences, such as my opponents, such as my teammates, if I'm away from that type of training for a while, I'm now not attuned to it. And so I'm not going to have, even though I've had that experience, it isn't permanent, such as what we think it is permanent in an information processing point of view. Almost like you could be away from a sport for 3 months and jump right back in and be really good at it again if you view information processing. Whereas on an ecological scale, I need to be attuned to that information. And if I haven't been perceiving that information for a while, that's where you hear that out of sync, or they're not clicking together. So I know that's a kind of a general definition, but I wanted to give that.
Yeah, no, that's good. One of the things that I think in my episode I did on this a couple of weeks that really bothers me about particularly decision making is how discrete it is in the information processing. The joking, you're a basketball player, you dribble up the floor, you stop, perceive, think, then do something. Like it doesn't work like that. There's this discrete moment that you decide to do something, then an action occurs, even though everything that led up to that was an action that was using information. It just seems like a really dumb way to do things, right? You're already taking in information processing. Why would you suddenly stop and then have this discrete moment when you decide to do this binary decision when you're already coupling to the information? Yeah.
Is it likely come from where the research based on information processing was in sequence tasks like that? So the task parameters almost did set almost a schematic of dribble up, process, shoot. So maybe the model itself fits the tasks it's trying to explain. I don't recall seeing any real information processing explanations of complex tasks, not that are really heavy or kind of really pulled together. So maybe it's an excellent explanation for the tasks it originally tried to explain.
And even with those explanations, one thing I mentioned on a call just a week ago or so is, and it was, in that 2006 Warren paper is, at some point I have to have direct access to the world. And if I don't have direct access to the world at any point, then it's just continuing to be mediated. And even something as simple as dribbling up the court, I have to have direct access to the world to dribble up the court. So that part is something I remember when I read that for the very first time. I paused, I sat back, and I thought, well, that makes it a quite different situation.
Mm-hmm. James?
Well, to put it concisely there, like Rob mentioned, probably the authors did a really good job putting it concisely when they said the world is its best own model, right? So obviously context then drives content, and we have to be focused more on those contexts, and obviously then the relations that are leading to that emergent decision-making and that emergent movement behavior. So if we're really putting it concisely, I think that we trust and respect what's out there in the world and that we have direct contact and access to it. And then our movement is able to be both the processes of perception and action, as we typically talk about, but even the ideas of cognition and intentions and our aims and our motivations and our desires and all of those types of things that get intermixed in that are going to scaffold or drive that perception action coupling in some of the processes and how we connect to our opportunities out there in the ways that we make decisions in a more embedded or embodied and emergent fashion.
Yeah, no, I think, James, yeah?
Sorry, I just wanted to kind of skip back to something Tyler was talking about before on being really attuned to a specific environment. And kind of ask you guys, what's your understanding of like perceiving an affordance in one context and then rediscovering it? I mean, not completely the same, but rediscovering something similar in another context. So like the cross-pollination of movement patterns between sports, for example. So the classic one in football is Samba, Capoeira, Ginga, kind of infusing some of the movement patterns we see in football. I'd just be really interested to get people's thoughts on that and how we make sense of it.
Any thoughts on?
Yeah, well, I would love to be able to share a lot more, and I apologize to listeners again for having to hear this raspy voice. But it's interesting that you mentioned that. With the elements, let's call it, or aspects of behavior that may have similarities from sport to sport that could potentially have some type of carryover. I think that there is something there. I personally haven't been able to put my finger on it quite yet. I do know that whenever we look at something, and I work in a facility that has football, baseball, softball. So baseball, if you walked into one of our sessions and you saw it, you'd be like, "Oh my goodness, that kind of looks like a rugby meets netball meets football." How is this beneficial? The representative level of sports scale isn't super high, and we're aware of that. We're aware of it's not as high, but it certainly has, it has interceptive qualities that are in it. It has force dampening qualities as they're having to make a secondary decision or they're having to attend to a secondary task. They're having to offload something as they're moving, much in the same way as their sport. And so while the representative level of sports scale may not be quite as high, something I've spoken to before at the Sport Movement Skill Conference of Shawn's is essentially trying to walk a little bit further across that bridge to the sport. And so going back to the question of how do we feel about that, I think that Keith Davids is doing a lot of that right now with enrichment activities and not being versus, but being, how can we have this general movement quality and specific, and how can they complement one another? So for me, I don't think it's a whole part whole or a compartmentalizing. I think it's more becoming attuned to certain aspects of the information that could be present in the target sport.
Can it be that certain athletes are more attuned to information in environments?
Yeah, and I think that could certainly have a play on it. And one thing I probably should have mentioned is maybe it's adding to that degeneracy, that ability to become maybe even more dexterous. And so when we look at, and Shawn uses the term movement toolbox, when we look at that landscape, or essentially our shifting ability to be able to solve movement problems, I think that we need to become attuned to a lot of information. And certainly there are times where we need to be more attuned to even more relevant information, such as camps are starting. And I need I need to be attuned to the spacing differences between myself and my other receiver, such as in American football, or I need to be attuned to the boundaries that are there. And so I think that attunement part of it is so valuable, because if I'm not attuned to my sport as I'm getting ready to play my sport, I think that's where you start to see behaviors emerge that are not very similar to that which you're found in their sport.
Okay, we're getting some interesting questions here in the chat here. I want to get to. I want to start. So I think people understand the basic idea of the ecological view, the decisions emerge. So I want to. There's a few ones I want to touch on. I'm going to get to here. One is one of the things I think people don't understand is how does I'll call it offline information play a role in decision making in the ecological view, right? For example, one thing they do in the paper is they don't dismiss it, but they really kind of downplay one of the bodies of work of one of my heroes in sports science, Bruce Abernethy, right? So all his work done on anticipation, where he's showing people videos of an unfolding sequence of play. It's a very passive decision, or is the serve going down the line or cross court, is very anti-ecological, is it right? It's very passive, it's uncoupled. But we don't deny, like every sport that we work in, athletes anticipate things before they start moving. Like in your sport, Shawn, in football, before a lineman starts rushing the quarterback, they're picking up information from the offensive lineman, the play, the situational probability. It's third and long, they're going to pass. How does all that, it can't be purely all, with ecological approach is not denying the role of offline information, saying it's all online. So I think that's something we need to clarify. So does anyone want to talk about that a bit?
Is this not addressed a little bit when they talk about skilled intentionality? Towards the end of the paper there. Mm-hmm. I've been grappling with this recently. I find this kind of a fascinating area. And the way I'm thinking about it at the moment is in relation to football, but it could be a number of different invasion sports. And the way I'm trying to make sense of it is that, let's say, unskilled intentionality could be just trying to, in football, play over the top of the opposition all the time. So you're only really, your intention is just to try and get the ball over the top. So you're kind of attuned to the spaces open up there, but nothing else. So it's like having one juggling ball, and you're just throwing that up and down. It's not very skilled. But then let's say you've got a second intention. So I can play over, or I can play around the opposition as well. Well, now you can maybe, do one or the other, just throw them up and down. But maybe you might get skilled at actually juggling them. So in the moment that you intend to play over, you might also be able to then perceive an affordance to play around as you're in the action of playing over. And then if you're really skilled, maybe you're able to juggle playing over, playing around, or playing through the opposition. And the skilled intentionality is to hold those intentions, to juggle them, and almost hold them, hold them in that space, right? Whereby as you're moving through the game, as you're doing one thing, you're so attuned to other affordances based on these intentions, these skilled intentions, that you see other affordances opening up. And the example that I have comes from my thesis and my time in Barcelona watching Andres Iniesta play. So he was, for those of you not familiar with European football, real football, sorry guys. He played for FC Barcelona, came up through their ranks, and he's the kind of guy that they have the story of, this is the guy, if you walk down the street, you wouldn't know he was a professional athlete. He's a small guy, be like my build, skinny, pale. He kind of looks like, he wouldn't, he wouldn't scare anyone like he's, anyway. But in these moments in the game, he just seems to have this magic. And the moment in particular that kind of encapsulated a lot of my time in Barcelona and trying to understand how the culture influences the way they play football, was this moment playing against Real Madrid. And he's only been on the pitch for 20 minutes. He came on at 60 minutes and he started to change the rhythm of the game and what he was doing. And he was moving the ball from side to side. And he was just kind of the rhythm of the play intensified. And there's this moment whereby he played down the left-hand side to Neymar, who's another very good player, on a couple of occasions now. And Luka Modric, who was playing for Real Madrid, he was recently voted the best player of the year after the World Cup. He sees, basically, they square up. And Iniesta opens up to play another pass to Neymar. And as that pass is being played, Luka Modric starts to step across. And rather than following through with the pass, Iniesta just adapts his movement so subtly, so slightly, and just swings past the ball and comes inside. But Modric is straight across. He's completely gone. He's like a puppet on a string. And then Iniesta wanders inside and plays this like world-class through ball to Lionel Messi. He goes through one-on-one, and he missed, believe it or not. So it's like the game-defining moment. Mm-hmm. And for me, what I find really interesting there is what's happening to Luka Modric, like in terms of like he's anticipated Iniesta's pass. He's perceived that affordance to intercept that pass before it's there, and he's moved like pre-reflectively. And then also how attuned is Iniesta? How is he juggling these skilled intentions? He's juggling the intention to play wide, but recognizing that as soon as something changes in the environment, like that opposition moves across, there's another door opening somewhere else. So I have the intention to go through that.
Mm-hmm. Ben?
I'm still not convinced by the intentionality component of ecological dynamics. Like, philosophically, it sounds nice, but what's the mechanism which links the intention of an individual or that strategic planning or tactical planning to that, specific gaze location, for example, to pick up information, or how they interact with the immediate opposition? What I don't think we necessarily understand at a ground level well enough what that mechanism is that links our intentions to our actual skilled behavior.
I thought something interesting in the paper that I've wrestled with quite a bit in my own brainstorming thoughts over the last number of years, to speak to that point, Ben, was the idea of consciousness, or questions of how that experience will arise, and then how that's driving the content of the movement behavior itself. I wrote down in my notes specifically, and then kind of wrestled with over the last number of days since we knew we were going to do this call, about consciousness sort of driving or facilitating the detection of the information, or improving the integration or specification of the information. And I think that's a really interesting way to think about it, because now all of a sudden it can kind of add value to our needs. It can add value to our intentions, and how maybe some of those cognitive thought processes are having a role or playing in the perceptual search strategies that you mentioned, Ben. I've often talked about encouraging my players on where to look, but not necessarily telling them what to see. And after I read these thoughts in regards to consciousness, and maybe potentially facilitating that detection of information, but also that integration or specification of that information, I started to wonder, do I have to tell them more about what they actually should be seeing, as opposed to where to look?
Yeah, no, I think those are a lot of good points. Going back to where I think the experience, where we say the experience comes in, and things like and intention. What I think we're talking, not that they don't play a role, they just play a role in a different way. They're not like Stuart was talking about, storing a catalog of things. Intention to me, Ben, is what they covered in the paper, selecting an affordance, right? The world has multiple affordance. Once you decide on your intention, what do I want to do? Do I want to run out the clock in the sport? Do I want to attack, be defensive? That's going to click in what affordance you're looking for. That's going to determine what information movement becomes coupled to. That's going to look like you made a decision, right? So I think the intention drives the goal, right? That you're right, though. that's kind of a loosey-goosey mechanism. We need, but it's way looser than the information coupling part, which we understand much better.
For me, I think that's one of the exciting parts is diving into intentionality and what it does mean. I mean, I think it was Turvey in 1990 with the affordances only emerge when intentionality and lawfully specified possibilities coordinate. So it's been there for a number of years, and it's interesting that we haven't explored it more thoroughly, because I think it's a super interesting space. And for me, I think that within the skilled intentionality framework, they talk about intentionality as a directedness towards the environment. So the running down of the clock would be something outside of that. And I'm not saying that doesn't contribute to players' intentions and things like that, but it's not necessarily, at least within the skill intentionality framework, how they would talk about intentionality. And then again, where it gets interesting for me as a coach then, well, how are we shaping players' intentions, or rather shaping their intentionality? Because are we helping them? Are we directing them towards the environment? Or are we talking about abstract concepts and ideas, or, just they've got a load of coach monologue running in their head rather than being attuned to the environment or being directed towards the environment?
Yeah, I want to put up a. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, sir.
Sorry. Given that obviously one of the things that the paper sort of centers on is this idea of sort of embodied cognition. There's something that occurred to me in what Ben said that was interesting, which is, have we become almost a little bit obsessed about the idea of what we're looking at? Because one of the things that really appeals to me about sort of an embodied account is that it's a combination, isn't it? They use a phrase in the paper they talk about a hyperlink, which is an interesting idea, but I almost feel as if it's like a hyperlink between a range of different information sources. So obviously there is what we see and hear. There's also sort of what we feel, sense, and what and almost what's intuitive. And if you take James's account of the Iniesta thing, this idea of sort of in intuition for me is almost, I feel like, a way of connecting all those things together. And this point about intention for me is a really dynamic thing. So in that account that James gives there, it makes total sense to me that Iniesta's intention changed probably several times. Mm-hmm. There's a broad intention, a big intention, which is I want to try and get the ball to somebody who can score. But there's micro intentions that are happening so initially it might be, in this scenario, I want to try and get the ball to Neymar because he's good at scoring. But then he's recognized, hang on a second, there's something going on here, and he may not have seen it. He may not have seen it. He might have just felt it. Now that might mean he's probably seen it, but there's something is wrong. It's the spidey sense thing that we can't. It's not a very good explanation, Ben. I totally agree with you about that. But I think a lot of us can probably resonate with the idea that, something's wrong. I can't put my finger on what it is, and I can't put my finger on why I feel that it is, but there's something wrong. And so then all of a sudden our intention shifts. That's no good anymore. Something else needs to happen. And then I'm looking for new information that's going to help me with that. And the information is helping me form the intention. This idea that there's the intention first, I'm not sure. I mean, I don't think anyone's suggesting that, but it's really dynamic, isn't it? Because information's coming at us and then we're refining intention all the time. And I just think it's really dynamic thing against a bigger backdrop. Now, I might be misrepresenting what you were saying, Ben, so I'm sorry about that. But that's just something that occurred to me in what you were saying.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting idea, Stuart. It reminds me a lot of Jacobs and Michael's kind of information for learning. The idea that there's information, we guide our actions, but there's also this higher order information that we're picking up that guides our way through the other source of information, the perceptual motor workspace. I just want to put up a good question here we got from, I think I can show it on the screen here, from Dave Mann. So how many people do you think still generally believe in a representational approach and that action doesn't play a role at all in enhancing perception and decision making? Is it just a straw man? Does anyone have any thoughts about that?
Before we jump into this, sorry, I think it's so cool that you can do that, Rob. That's
I know. I got Dave's picture up. He probably didn't expect that.
The way the platform affords that you can do that is quite interesting. Sorry, Ben, crack on. I was just wanted to say that.
That's that. I don't think there's many in sports-specific research that still try to provide representational accounts. Perhaps more it's neuroscience-based, is still trying to build on representations. That's more just my interactions on Twitter, more than my real knowledge of the whole representational kind of scholarly account.
You might be right about researchers, perhaps. I don't know. But for me, I think it's pretty sticky. I've certainly come across a few who are at least certainly very influenced by those accounts or those explanations. And you can very much see that in the way that they interact. So I've definitely seen some researchers in that space, and certainly in practitioners. It's very heavily influenced. Even just the language they use about explaining and the interactions they have with athletes is still very, very relevant. So I'm not. You might be right that maybe there's a change there, but I mean, Rob can speak to that more than I can. But it feels like there's still an influence there for me, anyway.
Yeah, I don't like in academia and research. The example I would point to, I don't think it's a strong. Go look at Gary Klein's naturalistic decision-making model. Right, one of the most popular models there is. It has boxes and boxes and a whole bunch of diagrams about what's going on and simulating the action, deciding. Then there's one box on the bottom, execute action. Right, so he's relegated action to one little box that has that's at the end. Right, so he's not incorporating it at all in the decision-making process. So that's one example I'd point to. Yes, there's still lots of people that maybe action, there's feedback that helps you to decide the next time, but playing this role for searching for information, I still think there's a lot of people that don't take that into account.
Yeah, and to add to what Stuart said and kind of spin David's question a little bit, I can certainly speak to from the practitioner level, it still runs pretty deep. And I feel like it runs pretty deep to a certain extent, and this may be a stretch, but I'm known to be pretty direct as a lot of laziness, quite frankly, and maybe not as deep thinking or actually looking at kind of what the sport looks like or how the sport actually unfolds. And the reason why I feel like this is so important to discuss, and kind of goes back to a handful of points that were made, but one of the ones that James was making, and when we're talking about intentions, is if this in fact is the case that we're still kind of toggling back and forth of figuring out how intentions are actually involved, doesn't this speak even more so to why an ecological approach may be something that we should really start to entertain, even if we are from the information processing, indirect perception side of the coin? And I say that only because we still need the individual. They're the ones that are playing the game. Yes, we can certainly provide explicit guidance. We can tell them where to look, maybe what area to turn their heads so they can hear better, or maybe giving them an opportunity to experience in movement, kind of going back to the paper we discussed last week, Stuart, in movement, they need to have the ability to experience it themselves. We're there to develop this co-adaptive relationship. And I think far too often the coach, and specifically in the practitioner level, they want to drive it, and they want to drive all of it because they have to relinquish power.
I see that a lot as well, Rob. I think for me, one of the interesting points around this, or like a case, if you like, an example of this, is with the popularity and the application of tactical periodization in football over here. Is everyone generally familiar with that? So I've looked into tactical periodization.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so it came out of Portugal, and essentially it's grounded in the ideas of complex adaptive systems. So, pretty closely aligned to ecological dynamics. And yet, in practice, it centers around having a game model. And the game model is just made up by the coach. It's a bunch of concepts and principles and rules that is then kind of passed down to the athlete through a traditional, more classroom style coaching approach. So I suppose what I'm getting at is you have this idea that's grounded in complex adaptive systems, and yet the application of it for the practitioner is just to create a game model of representations and then hand that down to athletes in a classroom style kind of teaching way. So there's no, they start with complex adaptive systems and then move straight back to a traditional approach, which is kind of dictating what happens and having, like as Stuart talks about, a backpack with like all these different tactics and solutions for every different minute moment of the game.
Does that not guide their intentionality?
No. Well, it can depend. I think it can be more fit to guide intentionality and less fit to guide intentionality, depending upon what you're talking about and depending upon how broad the ideas are. As Stuart mentioned before, if it's broad enough, that it can be in an invasion game, we want to get behind the opposition. And we can do that by going around, over, or through. Then within those broad intentions, and there's loads of possible solutions that emerge. But if it is when our right back has the ball, our right midfielder makes this run every time, and our number 9 does this every time, and the number 6 pulls in here every time, and we're going to play this pass in here, and as they move like this, then we're going to do this. Then that's not guiding intentionality, because also in the way that it's taught, it doesn't direct athletes to the environment. There's no directedness towards the opposition in the environment. There's directedness towards abstract concepts like make a triangle or a 5-second rule or like a defensive triangle. For me, that's not close enough. That's not helping people attune to the environment.
Mm-hmm. Any other things we're coming up on an hour here. Any other things people want to pull out from the paper that caught their attention? I think, like I said, I think it does a good job. Obviously this wasn't designed to be, focused on application. That's one way we could go. If we think this is the way that decision making occurs, where how do we apply this in practice? And I think obviously the other papers this group's written have focused more on that. But any other kind of topics that anyone wants to talk about out of that?
It's a topic that occurred to me earlier, Rob, in the question you posed. Actually, it's not necessarily directly related to the paper, but that question you asked about, the speed at which things happen, mm-hmm. and whether sort of an ecological explanation sort of fits better within something where kind of action is taking place rapidly, and therefore an account that suggests that there's this sort of mechanized approach where we're just pulling motor programs out from an imaginary backpack in our brain, it doesn't really fit just because of time. Well, interestingly enough, though, I think this still applies even in activities where there is more time. So I'm thinking about golf, because I've been thinking about golf quite a bit. I'm one of these I'm going to call us, Corona golfers, with a golf net in the garden. And I tell you what, there's people's going to be razor sharp short games out there, left, right, and centre.
Definitely.
And interestingly, some interesting experiences around creating variability within a limited space, but still trying to practice golf, and also without some of the feedbacks loops that you can get by ball flight, et cetera, et cetera. It's different. That's a different conversation for a different day. But even in a game like golf, where there's a lot of time. I was having this conversation yesterday with somebody who spent a bit of time with me on the podcast, a guy called Kendall McQuaid, who's essentially been wrestling with ecological conceptions or explanations of the development of golfing skill for about 20 years without really any reference to any of the literature. In many ways, his was an intuitive understanding based on, just his experiences and learnings from some other teachers, where the information processing explanation just didn't make sense to him, so much so that he fell out of love with the game altogether. And his mission now is to ensure that others don't fall out of it, because the methods they're using based on the information processing account was so substandard and didn't translate to golfing performance that they found them, for most golfers, he says, basically exist somewhere between hope and fear. And I think sometimes that can be the case for a lot of performers. So in a golfing context, it's really interesting. There's a lot of time to think, a lot of time to process. There's a lot of time to be super metacognitive. I've got to think about what I'm thinking about. And this idea that, I've got a lot of time to do that. But the problem about that is that kind of really gets in the way. And golf talks about this a lot. You've got to get out of your own way. And this idea of things. So interestingly, in a game which seemingly has a lot of time, in reality, the action takes place in fragments, because obviously you're actually the action is taking place in the time it takes you to make a backswing and make a through swing, and even in that is that's a relatively short period of time, but there's actually an awful lot of information taking place in that, and adaptations taking place within a 1.5 second action possibility. But even outside of all that, one of these things about this conceptualization is that the assumption is the more you can think about what you're just about to do, the better you will be at it. When in actual fact, most people's experiences of golf are the opposite of that. They play their best when they're not doing any thinking whatsoever. They play their best when they're purely in being intuitive and feeling and responding. And also what they find is that their practice experiences are such where they practice in these idealized situations, in environments where the lie is flat and there's no consequence to your shot, and it's a mat which is very, very false, or all these sorts of areas. And then they go out and then the game feels like chaos to them, because they're presented with all sorts of problems in terms of where the ball is, what the wind is doing, all these different information sources. No one's trying to steal it from them. All they've got to do is hit it. And yet it feels enormously chaotic to most golfers. And so it's just interesting to me that this essence of time, I'm not sure is as relevant as people give it credit for. Sorry, it was a very long-winded way of trying to explain something that's been rattling around in my brain.
Yeah. No, I think that's a really good point. And it's almost, I agree. If any sport, this perfect technique information processing would work, it's golf, right? The ball's just sitting there. You have all the time in the world to hit it. It's not dynamic. Well, we think it's not dynamic. It really is dynamic, but not in the same way as other sports. Any other kind of thoughts people wanted to pull out about this paper?
I did have something, and it kind of... It builds on what we've talked about, but it's not so related to the paper as such. So I apologize.
Oh, that's fine. Yeah.
I mean, it is, but I have a little note for myself here when I was reading it, and I kind of asked myself, is this what shapes intentionality? And it was the quote of Gibson. So it's on page 11 if you guys have the paper handy, but it says Gibson conceived another type of knowledge. Images, pictures, and written on surfaces afford a special kind of knowledge that I call mediated or indirect knowledge at second hand. This kind of knowledge or indirect perception is intrinsically shared because it involves the display of information to others. In these cases, information on which direct perception can be based is selectively adapted and modified in display. So for example, like if you have X's and O's on a board, and then it says, it says that it consolidates the gains of perception by mediating knowledge through communication. Can someone help me make sense of all of that? I have my own kind of ideas rattling around, but I'd be really interested to hear other people's thoughts on it and how far that goes, how far that indirect perception pushes out into the sociocultural realm. Like, are we pushing out towards social and cultural constraints?
Anyone want to jump in on? Yeah, I think that's a really interesting one to me. I think, obviously one of the things that makes inherent in this approach and makes it difficult to coach is the ability to verbalize what's going on, what the information is, what the required movement is. You can't, right? If it's coupled, we can't really describe the actual process. So I think what he's saying here is that he's not denying that we can communicate indirectly by symbolic representations of things like positions of players, spacing. I think what he would deny, of course, is that's what we're doing in the first place when we're act. We're not creating symbolic representations in our mind, but we can use it as a mediator of a way to try to communicate the direct, what's going on in the direct. That's what I kind of take out of it. I think he would say it's not going to be very effective, but at least it's something you can try. Yeah.
Totally. And then I suppose with that, to kind of try and bridge that gap, is that where intentionality comes in? I mean, as Ben was mentioning before, it's kind of not massively, it hasn't maybe been thoroughly explored yet. I don't know, or has it, Rob?
No, intentionality is kind of, like we've said, we kind of wave our hand at it a lot, but it's a difficult thing to get or, study, and manipulate. Yeah. I think that's a good, I think a way that we can move forward in a lot of this is thinking of these kind of things as like tactical things and this indirect knowledge as changing the constraints rather than changing internal representations or memories, right? When you as a coach, you draw on a board and give indirect information and you change intentions and constraints. So I want you to play defensively, or I want you to do this as a change in the task constraint, right? So I think that's a different way that I try to look at it.
Something's come to mind from I think it was when Andrew Wilson put on his blog a while ago around perceiving things that aren't there. And he was talking about beer cans in a fridge. Like we understand they're there, and the how they afford us the behaviour of knowing there's beer. I can't remember what he was actually talking about because it was a while ago I read it, but I don't know if he's listening and he can stick the link in the comments or something. But I think that might help us in terms of understanding maybe that intentionality to affordance-based link from a more hard-line eco-psych perspective.
Interesting that one stuck in your mind there, Ben.
Yeah. All it did is make me want to go get a beer out of my fridge right now. I totally lost focus of what you're talking about. But powerful image there, definitely. Any other thoughts on the?
I was just going to mention that, and I don't have it pulled up right in front of me right now, but it almost sounded like anticipatory. There's perspective control, and then the online information that's tuning our action is vitally more important. But it's not saying that maybe those contextual priors or the information that's available prior to it, or something we're maybe becoming aware of prior to information starting to guide our action online. Maybe that's kind of what he was alluding to a certain extent. That's almost what it sounded like. And one thing I also wanted to mention, kind of Shawn mentioned that prior to this call, knowing when we're coming onto it, kind of jotting down some notes. And I'm not sure exactly why I went back to this, but Shawn, you had posed an email question to about 10 of us. Rob, you were actually on it back in September of 2018. And it was, how do you define correct movement, or how is correct movement defined? And the last sentence in my answer was, I think that intentions are the gatekeeper to correct movement. I'm not quite sure what I mean by that still. I still am not real sure, except for the fact that I feel like they're involved. So this is something that's really unique that I'm probably taking away the most from this conversation is I still think that intentions are guiding our actions to a certain extent, but that doesn't mean they don't change, but probably something I'll spend a far amount of time exploring.
Well, it's certainly within the skill intentionality framework, they lean a lot on the idea of a form of life, which for me resonates and makes sense in terms of a broader cultural context in which behavior takes place. So you have a way of life and you have an ecological niche, and that essentially is your form of life, and that's the land. Within that, you then have standing practices, sports, for example, which will have fields of affordances. And then within that, you've got, local actors. And the thing I really appreciate about the skill intentionality framework is its attempt to work at these different grains of analysis and provide some synthesis that reaches out towards sociocultural levels.
I think you mentioned also, I wanted to touch on, Tyler, a good word I think that's touched on is anticipation in all this. I think anticipation is a point in decision making, and I think it's just there's in ecological we take a different view. The traditional view of anticipation is you get some advanced information, the serves going in that direction, then you use it to execute like a predictive movement to that point. Whereas we can get the same effect by coupling your action to prospective information, right? So you don't need to predict the future to do anticipation. If you're using prospective information, tells you about what's happening in the future, right? We're coupling your running to the bearing angle for tackling a person in football, right? Well, it looks like you're anticipating where they're going to be, but it's happening in a very different mechanism. Yeah. Any final thoughts on? Maybe kind of final thoughts on this paper and where we can go from here, both in terms of further development of these theories and further applying this. Ben, sorry, Stuart. Yeah.
Oh, sorry, I was jumping in and you were just about to go round. I'm sorry.
No problem.
One thing that occurred to me right at the end of the paper, and it's a really nice little line. Indeed, sports psychology is located in an exciting position to reveal how action is not ready-made implementation selected off the shelf, but a true choice behavior emerging from a range of action opportunities. Probably should have used that as my definition earlier on. But one thing that's interesting about that is the fact that this resides in the world of sports psychology. One of the things I've heard Keith Davids talk about is how excited he is by the fact that the practitioner and the scientist, or the practitioner and the researcher, are coming together to solve the problems together. And the questions are being posed by the practitioner, and then the researcher and the theorists are sort of working on some of these problems together and testing them in the field. And it strikes me that when we talk about like this whole dimension being within the realm of sports psychology, it almost feels a little bit one-dimensional. And I wonder whether there's an argument for almost like a new field to be created, which is something along the lines of, and I'm a bit guilty of liking to merge words together, so forgive me, but sports psy-pedagogy or something. I'm not quite sure. It's not quite right. It doesn't quite fit, but it feels to me like there's a merging of these two domains. And in actual fact, one of the things that's probably held us back is isolating science from the practice. And there's a genuine attempt by pretty much everybody on this call to try and do that, to try and bring the practice and the science together. And so I wonder if we ought to, if I was to maybe write something about this article, I would want to try and present that to the authors. Could we reconceptualize this as not just being the preserve of sports psychology and in some kind of a different domain? I don't know.
Totally. I think that's probably the reason, Stu, I attempted to make an argument for a transdisciplinary approach when we're dealing with sport. So yeah, I think I'm not sure if creating another field is the way to go, but certainly recognizing that we should be bringing more people to the table, and rather than starting with it from a disciplinary perspective, start with what are we trying to understand and how broad a scope can we start with, and then what lenses are useful to help us understand different aspects. And obviously you have to be careful in terms of ontology and epistemology, but I'd like to think that we could work in a more inclusive, holistic way as well.
Yeah, I agree. I think I forget who I was talking to the other day, and even the moving away from just sport, right? This applies to movement, rehabilitation, developmental issues. Obviously these authors know that as well. And this is just a targeted article focusing on sports. But any other kind of general thoughts you want to?
Well, and I think if we're going to allow the theory and some of the experiments and some of these philosophies to actually inform our practice methods and the environments that we create to hopefully facilitate better decision makers or more functional movement problem solvers, I think we have to continue to bring the discussion back to that point. And obviously that's sort of the world that I live in. and trying to let these things not only marinate and resonate with what we feel is right, but then also how it impacts the learning environments that we design. And so when we think about behaviors being more emergent or decisions being emergent, and these successive or simultaneous affordances and the acceptance of it, and how we can explain how affordances are actually selected or decisions then are emergent, I think are very pertinent to the discussion. And I think in order to give it more power, to contradict maybe some of the places that other theories or other ideas have had more weight or had more length of time sort of staying the test of time or standing the test of time, I think we always have to bring it back to not just how these theories compare to one another, but how it actually informs or impacts and influences our learning environments. Because there, for me, it's totally different, because now all of a sudden, if these movement solutions are going to be emergent and it's all dependent on the context, my learning environment looks considerably different than just allowing someone to make decisions that are maybe in a correct way or in a perfect way or in a right way or a wrong way, as opposed to being in a functional way for the performer to actually interact with the information, to allow their decisions to be more emergent, and to have sort of these layers of problem and solution dynamics, or like the authors refer to, interacting with that field of affordances. And there we become drawn into these interactions and having multiple opportunities to act, multiple affordances. Like, those things are all highly pertinent to the learning environment that then I would design, as opposed to maybe what the alternative would suggest, which would be the correct decision for them to make.
Cool. Any other someone jump in with as we wrap it up here?
Just a plug for the approach that I've been trying to take it. I would love it if people did some more kind of qualitative work in this area. I mean, my own approach was a couple of case studies using ethnography, which is something that was kind of recommended in skill intentionality framework again. But I see this as a fruitful approach for Shawn, what you just kind of mentioned there. So bringing some of these things to life in a real world context, and kind of getting a grip on what it looks like, and in no way kind of downplaying the importance of the hardcore ecological psychology stuff. And I realize I'm talking purely from the perspective of affordances as relational, but I would love to see more people get involved and kind of look at being situated and in context and working with some of these ideas.
Great. Oh, yeah, no, I agree. There's a lot of work to, and I think the key words you focused on there, case studies, I think is what we really need in this area to try to move it along. So, so thanks, guys. That was really good. I enjoyed talking about that. Just to give everyone a tease, that one of the things a few of us are talking about on here doing is a topic we're going to try to tackle. Stuart referred to the backyard golf. What we want to try to do is bringing representative design home, right? What can you do when you're stuck at home now training? How can you apply the principles of representative design to get the most of what you're doing at home? So we're going to do something along those lines. We haven't figured out exactly what, but keep an eye out for that. Stuart, did you?
Really looking forward to pulling that one together on. And I think there's a lot of people out there who are doing some pretty cool things. I'm seeing a lot of really good creativity on Twitter, which is fascinating. I know one of the people commented about that, Marianne, I think, and I think there's a lot of people out there who would probably benefit, and particularly parents actually, who have now become coaches for the first time, probably getting a sense of some of the challenges that we face. But also, probably doing some really exciting and clever things. And actually, it'd be really nice to be able to start to explore how we might be able to use some of the concepts and use them in a very practical way for people, so that when they're trying to design some games in the garden, they can do so in a way that's as meaningful as it can possibly be for some of these individuals.
Yeah, I think that's the point we're going to try to make. There are ways that you can try to maximize playing around in your backyard based on these ideas. Want to put up one more comment here. This is a nice one, given what we just talked about. So that's the first offer of the paper we just talked about. So you never know who's going to be listening. So
I wish I'd known. Oh, no, I'm glad I didn't know.
No, we'll be more than happy to hear our critiques. And
Stuart, that goes back to when you were talking about when you were scaling that rock and you were attached to the other climbers above you, and had you known, you may have froze even more so.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, good job I didn't know I was attached just to a sapling. Otherwise, I probably would have fallen off that rock. Yeah.
I just want to say, Rob, thank you so much for having me on. I've listened to probably about 8,000. I know you haven't had 8,000 episodes, but I've listened to about the equivalent of that. And this is the first opportunity I've had to come on. So greatly appreciate that. And obviously to engage with these fine gentlemen here, and obviously all the people that are commenting in the live chat box. So thank you for having me on, and certainly thank you to all the listeners for putting up with the raspiness of my voice. But it allowed me to, as Shawn told me earlier today, challenge myself, I think, with something like that.
Yeah, new constraint. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think we'll wrap it up there, and we'll sign off and keep an eye out we'll probably have one the same time next week. I'm not sure what we'll touch on, but we'll see everyone later. Thank you. Okay, that's it for today's episode. Thanks for the fun discussion, guys. If you want to find out more info on this topic, please check out episode number 173. And remember, you can contact me at robgray@asu.edu or follow me on Twitter at ShakyWeights. To find out more about the podcast, please check out perceptionaction.com. Finally, to support the podcast and receive bonus materials, including written transcripts, please head over to patreon.com/perceptionaction. This is Rob Gray from ASU. Cheers for now, and keep them coupled. Ecological